everyone, welcome back to On the Flip Side. My name is Adam Shawwalker, your host, and today we're going to be checking out this new album from Undeath, It's Time to Rise from the Grave. This is the sophomore follow-up release to 2020's Legions of a Different Kind, a suitably heavy rebirth of classic death metal that I thought was pretty good with the exception of some of the production choices, which I did enjoy in the notion that the dry production did help it feel a little bit more like an early death metal album, but it was a novelty that quickly wore off, leaving me enjoying the writing, but finding the record a little bit lacking on that end. With this new album, there's a much sleeker, much tighter cutting edge to the recording. Everything feels a lot more polished without losing its intensity. There's still a great raw sound that they've managed to preserve in the mix without letting things get too washed out or too muddy. And the songwriting on this one is probably just as strong as the first album, with some noted improvements on song structure and some more prevalent bass parts, which add a lot to the huge sound on this album. It does also seem like they put a little bit more focus into the vocals for this album as well, with a much more dark and heavy delivery than before. You can also tell there's a little bit more of an attempt to enunciate and really get the words out instead of just roaring out sounds, which is kind of a preference that I find neither here nor there, but I am glad they're changing it up a little bit. It does kind of act like a double-edged sword. It does work well with the tighter production, but I do kind of miss some of the raw vitriol that the older releases had. Anyway, I am just kind of appreciating how much these guys have developed their sound while still sticking very much to their guns. I mean, there are some tracks on this album that I absolutely think crush a lot of death metal classics. The title track, Rise from the Grave, for instance, has this killer guitar part that sounds kind of like a buzzsaw at parts. It almost reminds me of the main riff off of Flattening of Emotions by Death. The bass and drums are a wrecking force to behold, with these huge waves that demolish everything in the mix and create a really cool layer of sound for that buzzsaw guitar to really go wild in. And it's weird, it almost feels like the vocals are actually kind of catchy, and I mean, as catchy as death metal can get, but it's a really cool, distinct track. Tracks like Necrobionics and Head Splattered in 7 Ways have a really similar level of quality, with some cool, memorable riffs, some peaks in intensity, some top-notch builds and solos. Necrobionics specifically has some of the most discernible lyrics on the record, which seems odd for such a heavy song, but it still works really well. I love the themes of like armor plating, like the undead. It's really cool. Head Splattered in 7 Ways may just be my favorite track on the album. The energy that this song runs with through its entire runtime is infectious, it's violent, it's full of hate, it's an analog for audio murder. I love it. It's absolutely brilliant and completely depraved. And I think those are probably the main highlight tracks for me, though I do also especially enjoy Enhancing the Dead, which has kind of like an almost sludge metal heavy main riff. I'm getting some like jungle rot notes here, maybe some Sanguisugabog, if I'm pronouncing that right. Defiled again has a similar vibe to that last track, but maybe reined in just a little bit. Human Chandelier may be one of my favorite tracks just because of how absolutely over the top the whole track is as a death metal song. The whole concept is such a stupid stereotype of the whole genre pushed to a very extreme extent. It's kind of like almost borderline devourment at a certain point. Like, I know slam and death metal people don't always mix, but there's definitely some thematic crossover for this one. Bone Rot also is a really cool, kind of out there track that focuses more on like raising an army of skeletons, which is pretty sick. The track is also a really killer song to put at the tail end of the album too. It's memorable, it's pretty over the top, but it doesn't push things too far past like a Human Chandelier. And the song has a killer guitar solo that really sounds frantic or desperate in a way. It's really, really well put together. Trampled Headstones is also a pretty decent way to wrap up the album. I do think it's a little bit weak in comparison to some of the other songs, but it is still a fairly high bar for a death metal song. Really, I think the biggest issue is I'm just not the biggest fan of the opening track, Fiend for Corpses. I don't think it's bad, but like Trampled Headstones, there were better songs that could have taken its place. Though I do suppose it's kind of a pretty good intro in that it immediately gets across what this album is. And it does seem kind of odd to have an album like this be very middle heavy too. I think it might just have to do with the energy that is needed to start this kind of album and to end it are kind of hard to nail down. Maintaining the tone of a death metal record doesn't seem that difficult. All you have to do is just not throw in a ballad and keep the tempo up. But yeah, getting into it is kind of abrupt. There's not really a good way to bring on this level of intensity for this album other than with like just a slingshot start. I think to me, like one of the best lead-ins to a death metal album is a song I mentioned earlier, specifically Flattening of Emotions by Death, the first track off of Human. That song has this slow building, swelling drum beat that slowly fills the mix and lets the rest of the instruments kind of come in and join in one by one. Very brilliantly done. Obviously that's not like something that has to be done either, but it is one example of a song that I think works really well as an intro. It's kind of funny too, because the final track, Trampled Headstones, almost does like the complete opposite with a fade out in volume till the track ends. Anyway, I've kind of focused on this for too long as it is. I think the only track I haven't mentioned yet is The Funeral Within, which I think might be the most plain-sounding song on the album, or at least the closest to plain as you can get for this genre. It's definitely not bad, but it happens to be sandwiched between some of the best songs, some of the best material on the album, so it becomes a little bit easy to overlook. Anyway, I'm glad that this is the direction that Undeath is going, or at least sort of maintaining. This is a solid death metal record and deserves to be held in high regards by any fan of this genre of classic or like old school death metal. I think I'm feeling a pretty solid 8 on this one. Thank you all so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of the album in the comments below, and remember to like and subscribe. Also, check out my Instagram, my Reverb store, and my Depop. Links to those are in the description below. Thank you all so much again, and we'll see you on the flip side.